Welcome back to the deep dive. We've got a really interesting stack of sources in front of us today.
Yeah, these all seem to stem from a pretty intense conversation with a journalist.
Yeah.
Someone known for being, let's say, intellectually fearless.
Right. Not pulling any punches and really challenging, the standard media narratives.
Exactly. And the source material you shared, it's mostly a transcript, right?
Yeah.
A really detailed discussion.
Yeah, hitting on some incredibly complex stuff, proposed legislation, immigration rights.
Foreign policy approaches too, critiques of, well, elite perspectives, media bias. It's all in there.
It is dense material, no doubt. And our mission here in this deep dive is to take all this information you provided and sort of cut through the noise.
Extract the most important nuggets, yeah. Clarify things that might feel confusing.
Precisely. And give you a shortcut to being genuinely well-informed on what this specific source is putting forward on these topics.
So we're diving into some big questions drawn right from this material. Like, what's really in that bill they called the Big Beautiful Bill?
And the constitutional rights piece, especially for non-citizens, what are the key distinctions being made there? That gets tricky.
Oh, definitely.
Mm-hmm.
And how does focusing on domestic economics, according to this source, completely reshape foreign policy? Thinking about, say, China versus other places.
Right. And maybe touch on why some debates just feel so incredibly polarized these days.
So these are your sources, and this is your deep dive. We're here to help you make sense of them.
Okay, let's jump in. The first thing that really stood out from your notes was, well, some confusion around a big proposed bill.
Yeah.
You mentioned hearing conflicting things about this.
Yeah.
Big, beautiful bill.
And that makes total sense because the source itself points out something crucial. That version, the one that passed the House, that 1,000-page monster,
Yeah.
the source is explicit. That's not the final version. It's politically important, sure, getting it through the House.
A stepping stone.
Exactly. But the Senate is going to change it heavily. So what's in that specific document isn't what becomes law.
Okay, that's a key clarification right there. So the source then gets into the criticisms you've probably heard, the Democratic points.
Right, the arguments that you would, kick millions off Medicaid.
Yeah.
And that it's basically tax cuts for the rich.
Yeah, stealing from the poor and working class, essentially. What does the source say to those claims?
Well, the source offers a very specific counter-argument. It does acknowledge, yes, some people would lose Medicaid under this House version.
Okay, but who specifically?
Specifically, able-bodied individuals without dependents who are not disabled. That's the group targeted.
Got it. So not a sort of blanket cut across the board, but focused on that particular demographic.
Precisely. And the requirement being proposed, according to this source, these individuals would need to be doing something. Working or getting education or actively looking for work.
How much work or activity?
Around 80 hours a month, which, works out to about 20 hours a week.
Okay. And how does the source frame that requirement? Is it seen as harsh?
The perspective offered here is, well, maybe that expectation, 20 hours a week of work or related activity, isn't necessarily unreasonable, especially in exchange for potentially getting what the source calls gold standard health care.
That's definitely a different framing. And it's interesting, too, because the source pushes back directly on some other claims you might have heard.
Yes, very directly. The source states, based on their reading of the actual bill text, that claims about single moms and children losing health care. They're just not in this specific House bill.
Okay, so that helps clear up some of the static, at least based on this one source's analysis. And the source connects this kind of policy thinking to an evolving GOP.
Yes, seeing the GOP under Trump as trying to become, or maybe solidifying as, the party of the working class, and policy should align with that.
Which leads to this fascinating strategic point the source raises about potentially including tax hikes, but on the rich.
Exactly. Specifically targeting the top 1%, maybe those making over $1 million, or even $1 billion.
Why would that be significant, politically speaking?
Well, the argument presented is sort of twofold. First, it apparently has support among many Republican voters, fitting that working class shift.
Okay.
And second, it could put Democrats in a really tough spot politically. How do you vote against raising taxes on the absolute wealthiest?
Right. It kind of flips the usual script on the tax debate. And the source also touches on how working class people might view things like welfare fraud.
Precisely. The idea presented is that there's often a dislike for perceived fraud and support for work requirements for able-bodied non-parents if it's clear who is being affected and why.
So based only on this source's details, the person being interviewed isn't seeing this work requirement for that specific group as, like, some terrible catastrophe?
No, they don't seem up in arms about it, putting it that way. It's presented as a potentially understandable policy detail within that context.
Okay, let's shift gears. Another area you flagged as confusing was Elon Musk's involvement in hunting for government waste.
Ah, yes. The trillion-dollar promise.
Right. He initially promised, very ambitiously, to find, like, $1 trillion in cuts. What did the source say actually happened?
Well, the reality presented in the source was much less dramatic. The cuts they actually identified were more in the billions range, not trillions.
Billions is still a lot, but yeah, not a trillion. And there was that specific anecdote about Social Security.
Right. Apparently, it was really hard to find significant waste there. And the cuts they did try led to, well, seniors waiting for hours and hours on the phone just to get help. Not exactly efficient.
So why was it so hard to find these massive cuts, according to the source?
The perspective offered is that a huge chunk of government spending actually goes to populations most Americans want to help. Seniors, the disabled, children.
Things people don't generally view as waste.
Exactly. It's seen as necessary assistance, not something to just slash arbitrarily.
Okay, but then the source takes a really interesting turn, focusing on potential conflicts of interest involving Musk himself.
This is where it gets sharp. The source points out the potential conflict, right?
Right.
Him being asked to review government agencies.
That were apparently investigating his own companies.
That's the conflict highlighted, yes.
Yeah.
And it certainly raises eyebrows.
And then there are his business ties, especially China, right? Tesla's Shanghai supply chain.
Yeah. The source doesn't mince words there. Describes him as possibly China's greatest cheerleader in the U.S. because of those deep business connections.
Wow. And this all comes to a head in this really striking story from the source about a planned meeting on war plans with China.
Yes. Apparently, Musk was slated to be in that meeting.
Which the source saw as a massive conflict of interest, given the Tesla situation.
A huge conflict of interest is the phrase used. And according to this account, President Trump himself allegedly intervened.
To do what?
To stop Musk from attending that specific, highly sensitive meeting.
Interesting. So if we synthesize the source's interpretation here, it's like Trump might have appreciated Musk's support, but ultimately...
Ultimately, national interest came first. The source suggests it was maybe a signal, a signal that it was time for Musk to step back from that level of government involvement and focus on his private businesses again.
It's presented as a very clear boundary being drawn.
Yeah, that's the takeaway from the source's narrative.
Okay, let's try to unpack the next point of confusion you raised. This difference in how the U.S., in this view, approaches business and ethics with, say, Middle Eastern countries versus China.
Right. It seems inconsistent on the surface.
So what's the source's take on Trump's Middle East approach?
The source frames it almost entirely through an economic lens. The focus was on tangible benefits for the U.S.
Like what?
Things like bringing trillions into the States, encouraging investment here, building factories in the U.S., that kind of thing.
So it's about economic incentives, not about trying to, impose American values or getting bogged down in their internal issues. Civil rights, Sharia law.
Exactly. The source quotes this mindset as basically, I don't care what you do in your own backyard, as long as the economic benefit flows to America.
And this is explained as part of that America First logic.
Right. Strengthen America at home, avoid getting stuck in foreign internal affairs, or, importantly, foreign wars. The source mentions asking Saudi Arabia, for instance, to handle fighting ISIS in Syria as an example of shifting that burden.
And the source does note in passing that Saudi Arabia is seen as trying to liberalize with its Vision 2030 plan.
Yes. Then it touches briefly on Iran. The debate between negotiation versus economic strangulation through sanctions.
And the core concern there, fitting the theme.
Again, avoiding military conflict. The source uses this really stark phrase about not wanting to feed the children of the middle class into the maw of war. That's a recurring theme.
Okay, now let's pivot. How does the source contrast this with the approach to China? It seems different.
Very different, and this is fascinating. The source argues the U.S. approach to China, in this view, is seen less through a values lens, or even reacting strongly to things like the Uyghur situation or slave labor.
Less about those atrocities.
Yes, and more as a fundamentally domestic economic issue for the United States.
Domestic?
Sure.
How is China a domestic problem?
The core argument presented is that U.S. corporations got hooked, basically addicted to cheap Chinese labor.
Okay.
And China's economy, as described by the source, isn't purely profit-driven like ours. It's driven by the need to keep massive factories running, keep huge numbers of people employed.
Right, social stability through employment.
And that need, the source argues, led to strategies to get around things like U.S. tariffs, specifically mentioning the old de minimis loophole.
The under $800 shipments.
Exactly, allowing goods under $800 to skirt tariffs. The source claims this incentivized producing tons of, well, cheap crap, just to keep factories hunting and exploit that rule.
And the argument is that this flood of cheap imports directly hurts American workers.
Yes, by displacing jobs that could otherwise be here. So, synthesizing the perspective, the source attributes to Trump. The goal is breaking that addiction.
Addiction to cheap Chinese labor and imports.
Because in this view, it has disinherited the American working class, prevented them from accessing the American dream.
So the idea is bring manufacturing back. Maybe high-tech manufacturing, AI-powered factories.
Right, so American workers can earn better wages and then afford better quality, maybe even American-made goods, like elites already do.
The source contrasts the, cheap clutter in poorer homes versus expensive, durable items in wealthier homes.
Exactly. That contrast is used to illustrate the point. So in this specific viewpoint, China becomes primarily a domestic economic challenge about restoring opportunity for American workers, not mainly a foreign policy or human rights issue.
That definitely reframes the whole U.S.-China relationship through a very particular economic lens, which leads us right into that tough ethical question you brought up.
Yeah, the responsibility question.
Does America have a responsibility not to do business with countries that, engage in clearly unethical behavior?
It's a critical question.
Mm.
And the source's response ties it directly to domestic well-being.
How so?
The perspective offered is that your feeling of moral responsibility towards the rest of the world is kind of linked to how financially secure you feel at home.
Okay, explain that a bit more.
So the source posits this hypothetical. Imagine a universe without, say, the extreme wealth inequality we see. Now, the source mentions the top 10% controlling over 60% of GDP. Or an economy not seen as funneling wealth from the working class to the elites.
In that world.
In that world, the U.S. could maybe have a national debate about extending help globally, taking strong moral stands through trade policy, and so on. But, the source argues strongly, in the current American reality, where elites are perceived as doing great, while the working class is struggling for those elites, to then impose an ideology of global moral responsibility onto that struggling working class.
Is seen as fundamentally immoral by this source.
Yes. That's the core of the argument presented.
And this brings us to that really powerful analogy the source used, the oxygen mask one.
Exactly. That analogy is key to understanding the logic behind the America First economic focus described here.
What's the analogy again?
The point being made is that the vast majority of the country, the working class, is seen as struggling so much financially that they can't even put on their own oxygen masks.
You can't take care of their own basic needs.
Right. So to then demand that they prioritize putting oxygen masks on people in other countries through economic sacrifice or foreign policy choices
is seen as completely out of touch and an unfair burden from this perspective.
It really crystallizes the source's argument about prioritizing domestic economic health first.
Okay, that makes the logic clear, whether one agrees with it or not. Let's revisit the debate around Trump's economic impact, specifically tariffs.
Right, the inflation argument.
You mentioned hearing the common critique, maybe from figures like Cenk Uygur, though the source doesn't name him directly, that tariffs just cause inflation, hurting the middle class by making things like iPhones more expensive.
Yes, that's a very common line of argument. The source tackles this head-on and draws a really important distinction.
What's the distinction being made here?
The source argues that the kind of inflation that truly crushes the working class is inflation on necessities.
Things like
gas, groceries, basic living costs. And the source actually claims that the prices for those things decreased under Trump.
Okay, so that's claim one. What about the expensive iPhones or BMWs?
That's claim two. The source says price increases on luxury goods due to tariffs are fundamentally different from inflation hitting working class necessities.
How are they different in this view?
The argument is that those luxury items, new iPhones, German cars, etc., were artificially cheap to begin with.
Cheap because?
Precisely because the jobs to make them were sent overseas, primarily to China. This benefited the elites, who are the main buyers of these high-end goods, far more than the average worker.
Okay, So the source is saying higher prices on those luxury items are just reflecting their true cost if made with, say, American labor.
Exactly. And that reflects money potentially going into American workers' pockets instead of just benefiting elites buying artificially cheap luxury imports.
And the source contends that mixing up these two types of price increases necessities versus luxuries is misleading.
Yes. The argument is that conflating the two ultimately benefits the elites who want to keep buying those cheap luxury goods manufactured overseas.
You know, this actually connects to something you shared earlier about your own experience,
Oh.
about how you don't always notice price changes on really expensive things like new phones or cars because, well, you don't buy them very often.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
It's not part of my regular budget watch.
It kind of illustrates the source's point, right? That the impact of tariffs on high-end goods is felt very differently depending on your own economic situation.
It really underlines that economic policies don't hit everyone the same way. There are distributional effects.
Definitely. Okay, let's shift again, this time to the critiques of Ivy League universities that came up in the source material.
Right, the campus issues.
You summarized some common criticisms you'd heard that actions against certain students are punitive, maybe selectively silencing people, possibly infringing on the First Amendment.
Yeah, and you specifically mentioned the case of one student, Mahmoud Khalil, and the debate around his speech and actions.
So how does the source tackle this? It seems like a free speech minefield.
The source makes a very sharp distinction here, separating the moral dimension from the purely legal one.
Okay, let's start with the moral argument presented in the source.
On the moral side, the source is incredibly blunt. Distributing materials that praise the October 7th attack, which the source refers to using the term Al-Aqsa flood, is presented as just morally unacceptable. Full stop.
Mm.
The message conveyed is basically, get out. The source even uses a pretty intense analogy involving Marilyn Manson to convey the level of moral revulsion.
Okay, so a strong moral condemnation.
Yeah.
But how does the source separate that from the legal question of free speech?
This is key. The source argues forcefully that this specific case, the Khalil case, is not actually about free speech protections, legally speaking.
Why not? What are the legal reasons cited?
Several specific points are made. First, it's alleged in the source that the student outright lied on his visa application,
Lied about what?
about failing to disclose that he had worked for UNRWA, and the source notes that the Biden administration had reportedly linked UNRWA closely to Hamas and had defunded it based on those ties.
So the argument isn't just about the content of the flyers he distributed, but about alleged visa fraud association with an organization the government linked to terrorism.
Exactly. The source's legal argument is, if you work for an organization designated or seen as tied to terrorism, and you distribute their propaganda, and you allegedly lied on your visa application about it, that violates the terms of your visa. Deportation, in this view, becomes a legal slam dunk, not a free speech issue.
And to strengthen this point, the source contrasts his case with another one mentioned.
Yes, a Turkish woman who wrote a pro-BDS op-ed. Her case is presented by the source as much harder to deport on,
Why?
because it looks much more like pure political speech. And the Supreme Court has generally upheld free speech rights for immigrants, even those here illegally, when it comes to expressing political views. She apparently got bail and was likely allowed to stay.
So the source is drawing a line. Political opinion, like BDS support, is one thing, but alleged visa violation through misrepresentation plus association with a group linked to terrorism while distributing their materials.
Yeah.
That's different territory legally.
That's the distinction being made. And this ties into another crucial legal nuance the source highlights, which you mentioned finding confusing.
The difference in rights.
Yes, immigrants, even undocumented ones, do have the same free speech rights as citizens under the First Amendment. But, and this is the critical part for deportation, they do not have the same due process rights in deportation hearings as they would in a criminal trial.
Okay, that distinction is huge and often gets blurred.
Yeah.
Let's really unpack that using the Maryland man case from your sources, because that one sounded particularly complex regarding constitutional rights and immigration.
It's a really important distinction the source emphasizes to differentiate the criminal justice system from immigration proceedings. So if you're on U.S. soil, anybody, and you're accused of a crime,
Like robbery, assault, whatever.
right, you get full criminal due process rights, right to a jury trial, right to legal representation, presumption of innocence, all of that. That's what most people think of as constitutional rights in court.
But immigration court isn't like that.
Fundamentally different, according to the source. It's described as an administrative hearing. It's not considered a real court in the same constitutional sense as a criminal court.
And the judges aren't independent.
They work for the executive branch. They report up to the president ultimately. Unlike federal judges who have life tenure and are part of the independent judiciary.
And then there's this concept of expedited removals.
Yes, the source points out the Supreme Court upheld these in 2020. This basically allows Border Patrol, under certain conditions, to pick up and deport undocumented immigrants who crossed recently within the last 2 years, I think the source said.
Without even seeing an immigration judge.
Correct, without a hearing before a judge. So the idea that everyone caught crossing illegally automatically deserves a full trial before deportation. The source dismisses that as nonsense within this specific legal framework.
Wow, okay. So deportation is administrative, not criminal, and sometimes skips the judge entirely. What about habeas corpus? Does that apply?
The source clarifies that in the context of someone already having a final deportation order, habeas corpus is really their only remaining right.
And what does that right allow them to do?
It's the right to challenge identity, basically, to argue, you've got the wrong person, I'm not the individual named in this deportation order.
And the source notes that when known gang members don't file habeas corpus challenges,
The implication drawn is that they probably are the person the authorities say they are. They're not challenging the identity because it's correct.
okay, understanding those distinctions, administrative hearings, expedited removals, limited habeas corpus, let's try to piece together the Maryland man situation again, strictly based on the source's account. It was confusing.
Okay, let's walk through it as the source presented it. Step 1. This individual already had a final deportation order against him, issued after whatever due process he received in immigration court.
Okay, so deportation was already legally decided.
Yes. Then he made a claim that he would be in danger from a rival gang if he were sent back specifically to his home country, which was El Salvador.
And a judge believed him.
A judge issued a stay. But, and this is critical detail from the source, it was only a stay of deportation to El Salvador.
Not a cancellation of the deportation order itself.
No. The deportation order remained valid. The stay simply meant the U.S. government couldn't send him to El Salvador. This created a legal obligation for the government to find a different, safe third country that would agree to take him.
And the source claims that didn't happen.
Right. The source alleges that due to what it calls corruption by liberals and activists in the system, no third country was found. And this allowed the man to remain free in the U.S., where he allegedly went on to commit further serious crimes.
Okay, that's the claim. What happened next in this account?
The source says the Trump administration then located him and deported him, but they sent him to El Salvador.
The one country the stay specifically prohibited.
Exactly. That was the error, according to this account.
Which is why the Supreme Court got involved.
Yes. The Supreme Court ordered the U.S. government to bring him back to the United States. The source emphasizes, at U.S. taxpayer expense.
Well, why bring him back? To let him stay?
No, not according to the source. He was brought back only so the U.S. government could then fulfill its original obligation. Find a different third country to deport him to, one that wasn't El Salvador.
So the Supreme Court was enforcing the specific terms of the judge's stay, not overturning the deportation itself.
That's precisely how the source presents it. It's framed as correcting the procedural error of sending him to the wrong country, not granting him a right to stay in the U.S.
And the final twist in the source is telling.
Apparently, El Salvador then refused to take him back from the U.S., effectively keeping him as their citizen and dealing with him as a criminal there.
What a complex sequence of events. It really highlights the legal intricacies.
Absolutely. And it's presented by the source as an example of legal complexities. And from their viewpoint, how certain actions or alleged systemic issues can lead to unintended and sometimes tragic consequences.
And the source definitely draws political conclusions from cases like this and the Harvard campus situations we discussed earlier.
Yeah, the argument is that when Democrats are seen defending institutions like Harvard, the source brings up associations like Xi Jinping's daughter being educated there, or bin Laden family connections cited in the source.
Or white knighting, as the source puts it, for individuals like the Maryland man or the student accused of supporting Hamas.
It's framed as total political suicide, positions that are easily attacked, and that the Trump administration, according to the source, uses very strategically against them.
It's presented as Democrats getting trapped, defending things that are politically unpopular with large segments of the electorate.
That's the political analysis offered in the source.
Which leads directly into another major question you had based on the source material. Why? Why do elements on the left seem to defend positions that this source portrays as politically damaging or just counterintuitive?
Right, it seems like they're repeatedly dying on this hill, so to speak. Well, what's the source's explanation?
The source offers a pretty stark explanation. It argues that the left, specifically the Democratic Party establishment, doesn't really have a clear, positive agenda for fixing the country's core problems.
And instead?
Instead, they're seen as seeking power mainly out of a sense of, well, entitlement, like it's their turn or they deserve to rule.
And there's that related argument that the Democratic Party isn't really the party of the working class anymore.
Exactly. The source makes that case very strongly, arguing it's now primarily the party of the wealthy and the elites.
Does the source offer evidence for that claim?
Yes, it cites specific statistics, things like the percentage of very wealthy individuals who identify as Democrats, pointing out that the richest counties in the U.S. consistently vote blue, and highlighting the massive campaign donations flowing to Democrats from places like Silicon Valley, Wall Street, big law firms, management consulting.
So painting a picture of the party being funded and led by the affluent.
Right. And then the source makes this really provocative claim about how certain policies, like open borders, allegedly benefit these same elites.
How so? What's the argument there?
The argument presented is that open borders allow elites to hire undocumented immigrants for much lower wages, often off the books, without health care or benefits.
For jobs like?
Childcare, landscaping, house cleaning. Jobs they'd otherwise have to pay American citizens significantly more to do.
So the source is framing open borders not as a humanitarian issue, but as a policy that directly subsidizes the lifestyles of the wealthy elite.
That's precisely the economic argument being made. It's pretty pointed.
Okay. So how does this tie into political strategy, according to the source?
The source contends the Democratic strategy involved years of attacking Trump almost solely on the grounds that he gave tax cuts to the rich.
Even while, according to the source's stats, many of those rich people were voting Democrat.
Right. And meanwhile, the source claims working class people of all races were actually shifting towards the Republican Party.
Why?
Because, in this view, they saw Trump, despite his flaws, as offering an actual agenda aimed at making the American dream achievable for them again.
And what was that agenda, as described by the source? It's characterized almost as co-opting traditional democratic ideas.
Exactly. The source uses the phrase that Trump stole the New Deal Democrat agenda.
Okay, what does that mean in practice, according to this source?
It's defined in a few key areas. First, socially moderate. The source uses abortion views as an example, arguing for something like safe, legal, rare, maybe with a consensus timeline around 12 or 15 weeks.
Which is presented as different from the broader Roe v. Wade framework.
Yes, presented as a more moderate, potentially consensus position. Second, economics.
That's the economic piece.
A focus on creating a tight labor market which forces wages up for workers, and using tariffs to encourage bringing manufacturing jobs back to the U.S.
Policies the source notes used to be pretty standard Democratic platform planks decades ago.
Right, but now associated with Trump in this narrative. And third, foreign policy.
What's the stance there?
Fundamentally anti-war. The source claims this used to be a core Democratic value, but now Trump owns the anti-war position, while Democrats are painted as favoring more intervention, more funding for conflicts, seemingly forever and ever and ever.
So the overall picture is of Trump adopting traditionally Democratic working-class policies, leaving the current Democrats perceived as the party of elites with different priorities.
That's the core argument the source builds, and this whole critique of the left and elites connects directly to the media critiques that run throughout your source material.
Yeah, the media gets hit pretty hard.
And you mentioned personally seeing narrative shifts in your own field, like the whiplash on healthy at any size versus the focus now on obesity and GLP-1 drugs, or inconsistent reporting on medical treatments over time.
It does make you wonder about how narratives get shaped and why they change. That personal experience seems to resonate with the source's broader media critique.
And the source doesn't hold back, right? It levels specific criticisms against certain media figures, maybe not naming all of them, but implying
they act as ideologically gatekeeping. Yeah, putting out propaganda, not news. Accusations of enabling cover-ups on big stories.
Like the source mentions the COVID lab leak theory or the Hunter Biden laptop story, presented as examples of media narrative control.
It's a strong charge. And the source uses that analogy to explain the perceived effect of this. The red ants, black ants in a jar.
Can you explain that analogy?
The idea is you have red ants and black ants living together fine in a jar. But if someone shakes the jar violently,
They start fighting each other.
exactly, they attack each other, thinking the other ants are the enemy. They don't look outside the jar to see who's shaking it.
So propaganda, in this view, is the shaking, designed to make regular people fight amongst themselves.
Right, distracting them from underlying systemic problems or from identifying the perceived real bad guys or the people pulling the strings who benefit from the division.
And the source concludes this point by saying the media has, like, a sacred responsibility.
Yes, a sacred responsibility to provide honest information so people can make informed decisions, understand different perspectives, and potentially find common ground. It's a critique rooted in a belief about the media's vital role in a democracy.
It's a powerful indictment, certainly, of how information flow is perceived by this source. Okay, let's tackle the final big theme: polarization in America.
Ah, yes, the idea that we're hopelessly divided.
We hear it constantly. It feels like the defining feature of our time. What's the source's take on this? Is it real?
The source offers a really provocative counter-narrative here. It basically says polarization is largely a myth.
A myth. How can that be?
The argument is that the real depolarization exists primarily among the elites, the political class, the media class, the academic class. They are intensely polarized.
But not necessarily the country at large.
Not nearly to the same extent, according to this source. The argument is that out in the real world, most Americans get along okay.
In their daily lives.
Yeah. They work together, they worship together, they raise their kids next door to people with different political signs in their yards. There isn't this constant debilitating division in most everyday interactions.
That's certainly a different perspective than we usually hear, and the source actually ends this part on a surprisingly optimistic note.
Extremely optimistic, actually. Despite all the perceived efforts, especially by media, which the source sees as often driven by financial incentives, like engagement metrics from conflict.
Despite those efforts to divide people.
The source argues the American people are fundamentally too good for it to work completely. Too smart, too moderate, too loving, too caring, too tolerant. They resist being fully polarized.
So the fundamental goodness of the average American wins out.
That's the core belief expressed.
Sure.
Betting on the American people means you'll win in the long run. Betting against them, which the source claims the elites have done, means you'll eventually lose.
And there's that final anecdote the source shares to illustrate this.
Yes, about defending tariffs online and getting messages afterwards. Not from elites complaining, but from working class people, truckers, farmers.
What did they say?
Things like, keep fighting. We're willing to pay a bit more if it means jobs come back. We'll make sacrifices for the country. The source contrasts this patriotic willingness to sacrifice among average folks with the perceived complaints from those who already have the most. It's presented as proof of that fundamental decency and patriotism.
Wow. Okay, that was quite a journey through this source material, a real deep dive.
Absolutely. We went from the nitty-gritty of bill language and work requirements
To the complexities of immigration law, the source's specific take on due process versus administrative hearings.
and into that unique economic framing of foreign policy towards the Middle East and especially China.
Tackled the source's sharp critiques of elites, universities, and the media, using their analogies like the oxygen mask and the ants in a jar.
And ended with this counterintuitive argument that maybe deep polarization is more of an elite issue than a Main Street reality, according to this source.
Our goal, remember, was to take this really dense and complex source material you shared with us and just give you a clear walkthrough.
Highlighting the key insights, the main arguments, the specific perspectives offered within the source, so you can get up to speed quickly on what it actually says.
And as you think about everything we've unpacked today, especially that final point from the source, the idea that widespread polarization might be more narrative than reality, more of an elite phenomenon, here's something to chew on.
If that perspective holds any water, how might you think about approaching discussions or disagreements with people who see the world differently?
And maybe more fundamentally, what does it imply about where you choose to get your information and how you try to understand the complex currents shaping our world?
Lots to think about. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.